Next up to speak is the President of the nation, Dr. Javier Milei.
Good morning. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's a huge pleasure for me to be here. Where it congregates, the productive sector, which is not only the strongest in Argentina, but also the most productive worldwide. I mean, considering the tax load you guys carry and still managing to produce is nothing short of a miracle because you're the best in the world. So first off, big congrats to all the heroes in this room. You're the heart of Argentina. What I'm going to try to spill the beans on today is to paint a picture of what we have received as an inheritance, so y'all can catch what we're up to. And once that's crystal, to fill you in on where we're headed. So basically, when we got there, we ran into a situation at the public office, ready to face the worst crisis in Argentine history. Let's mix in some elements, shall we? Social issues even worse than what we saw before 2001. Looking at monetary imbalances, worse than what we faced before the big inflation scare back then. And we had this mess at the central bank, right? Like worse than back in '89 before hyperinflation hit. So yeah, all the signs were there for the mother of all crises in our history. If you want to look at it from a different angle, when a country is running a twin deficit at 4% of its GDP, that's tricky. Complicated. When it's hitting 8 points of GDP twin deficit, we're on the edge of a major crisis. We inherited this situation with twin deficits at 17% of the GDP. In other words, it's like we're truly on the brink of disaster. Even though this whole mess is super complex, it's also true we knew what we were getting into. We knew getting into power wouldn't be a walk in the park. I mean, if the populists had stayed, you think they'd have straightened things out? No way, right? So you gotta realize, us coming into power as a pure and clear-cut liberal expression like we stand for. In that sense, it wouldn't happen under normal circumstances, especially in a country that's been festering with socialism for over a century, whether it's with bad manners or those also polite ones who end up being the crooks' buddies, because it looks like they never learned that you can't be soft on the hardliners. So in that situation right there, we're basically dealing with these twin deficits, you know? Out of those 17 points, 15 were all about the nation's combined deficit and 5 in the Treasury, and 10 in the central bank. Then with that in mind, the inflation rate for the year ended up topping 200%. During the first week of December, prices were going up by 1% every day, which is pretty much like 3,700% for the year. When you look at the first 2 weeks of December, there's this speed up that shoots the annual rate to 7,500%. Checking out the inflation patterns and how they're rolling, the excess cash flow and the central bank issues are messing with the inflation rate. Let's say if there's like a total crash in the demand for cash, we could be looking at inflation rates shooting up to 15,000% a year. Sounds totally nuts, right? But for real, when y'all check out the inflation wholesale numbers in December, good Lord, 54%. If you guys crunch the numbers, taking 1.54 and powering it up to 12 to annualize it, you'll see that inflation was on a rocket to like 17,000%. That means all this craziness wouldn't have even been a thing if we'd gone ahead and backed it with money. I mean, those folks, the ones going over the top, to put it nicely, talking about fixing things with budget deficits and just printing more dough. That was basically an invite to the biggest mega crisis in Argentina's history. Just picture it, we would have faced not just skyrocketing hyperinflation, but also we would have hit poverty levels around 95%, dude. So just imagine what this country would have been like right now. That's why the only way you guys could have stopped this was by straight up slashing money printing. Look, if you pay attention to the progress, the trouble we had with the Treasury was massive, right? Dealing with a 5-point fiscal deficit is bad enough. But the mess inside the central bank, man, that was a whopping 10-point fiscal deficit. From that perspective, we got this. We rolled out a stabilization program, but made sure it was by the book. And what we did basically was go after the fiscal elephant in the room with a budget cut aimed at getting to zero deficit by the end of the year. By the end of the year, fixing up the central bank without shutting down the exchange market where the gap was around 200%. In that regard, we started a bunch of really tough cuts. Basically, we let go of 50,000 public employees. We axed 200,000 social programs that were handed out all wonky. We completely cut off public works. Slashed those arbitrary transfers to the provinces cold turkey. Meaning there was definitely some melting away of value there. Some assets got diluted for sure. And on the flip side, we started cleaning up the mess at the central bank that was handed to us. The government was in the hole with 11.5 billion bucks of negative net reserves. And the currency realignment we did means we now got 9 billion buckaroos in the bag since we took over. But that's not all, folks. We had a goal, right, to hit that real zero deficit in financial terms by the end of the year. When did we start seeing the numbers shaping up? Given all that, we figured we could reach a primary balance by January and financial equilibrium by come March. That gave us solid assurance, you know? It boosted our confidence big time. Think about it, Argentina's been deficit spending for the last 113 years. Yeah, ran a fiscal deficit for all 103 of them. Out of 22 crises it faced, 20 were because of money woes. So let's face it, the main problem we had to tackle was this whole deficit mess. Talking about the fiscal deficit, which I'll get into from a different angle later. Hindi si Sosin po, we decided to go hardcore with policy, you know? Cut out public works like I told you, scrap those discretionary transfers, check the budget lines, but didn't take a dime from anyone, at least as far as folks know. Don't fall for the lies of big spenders. So in that context, why zero deficit important? Because zero deficit means that I ain't gonna take on more debt, just gotta roll over what I currently have so my debt doesn't grow anymore. As long as the product doesn't drop, that keeps my debt to product ratio steady. So if the debt to product ratio stays the same or drops, the country becomes solvent. It's a deep way to ensure it. Give us intertemporal solvency. And plus that eventually leads to lower interest rates because the country risk drops and that creates more room, whether to spend or not. Not for me, but yeah, to cut taxes. So in that context, what was that? And to our surprise, we hit a positive financial result in the first month. Looking good on the financial front in the first month. And that, my friends, got a thumbs up from the fund because this kind of thing never happened in Argentina before. Didn't happen there, never, not even in the whole wide world. No one's ever pulled off a fiscal adjustment of like 6 or so GDP points in 1 month. I know some folks might go, yeah, it's easy, so easy. But we're the ones who actually stepped up to the plate to make it happen. Not just that, we also kicked off cleaning up the central bank's balance sheet. And that's super important to keep in mind. Just look at us. Our money supply went through the roof for all sorts of reasons. One being we snagged ourselves 9,000 million bucks. So yeah, someone could see this whole money printing thing as just what happens when you're buying dollars because there's a demand for cash. So initially, it ain't a problem, right? But then our money supply starts shooting up because of some darn moves pulled off by the last government. I'm talking as a way to ease up the exchange rate, okay? And then there's also our money supply going through the roof because we're paying out interest on reserves. What we've got on our hands are these so-called repo operations, which are basically what's been handed down to us from those LELIC debts. Just look at the nasty piece of work the last administration left us, those LELICs that were like 3 times our monetary base. When we took over, these helix things had shifted into short-term mode, you know, supposed to be for like 30 and 60-day operations. They flipped it to 1 day just to show you, bam, the crisis was right there staring us in the face. Besides that, just 11 days after taking over, we had a deadline with the International Monetary Fund, and our central bank was out of dollars. So what's the deal with that whole thing? Check this out, despite all that mess. Since we've been in charge, the money supply hasn't changed one bit. Heads up, because you know, maybe one day, let's say there's some big moves, things spike, but then it all evens out. Just saying, because it happens. You know, those purists find that one day when a deadline hits, stuff shifts around and then it's back to normal the next day, but still. Even though, of course. So yeah, the money supply, we've nailed it at 10 trillion. But what's the big deal about all this? Because we're soaking it up through taxes and also through Brill. Oh, by the way, the last guys left us with a cool $50 billion in debts to importers that was freezing stuff up. Imports, huh? Not exactly a pretty deal they've pulled off with their rates, right? Because they were buying at the official rate, stuff that would have cost them a whole lot more on the parallel market. So, in that regard, what we've got here is what's happening to us. Is that now under this scenario, through the Treasury and Boreal routes, we're soaking up money and keeping the cash flow steady. Means we're still dealing with the same old monetary liabilities when it comes to the monetary base. But the thing is, we've now landed ourselves an extra 9,000 million bucks. Therefore, what you guys are seeing is that the system's looking way healthier now. So those 10,000 million, yeah, they're now backed by the $9,000 million we snapped up. The fallout of all these moves, a hefty drop in inflation. Do you guys remember the numbers we were sharing when we hit the 3rd week? We'd already racked up a 30% inflation by then. Me, when I take a peek at those high-frequency indicators, man, so one weekend I get this note, right? Gabriel Anello, and he's like, what if it hits 30 and the number 30 is big because it meant that last week, well, inflation just stopped in its tracks. And the real deal is that when it ended up at 25, it was a real win because it means prices even backtracked to week 2. After that, talking about the hiccups and the January seasonality, if it had hit 25, that would have been good news, but it came in at 20. And everything seems to be pointing to around 15% this month, despite the hike in prepaid plans, the tariff increases, all that stuff, according to market consensus. So yeah, the deflation process is still going strong. If you look at inflation without the regulated stuff, it's cruising at like 10, and for food, it's at 9. It's clear we're on a slowing down path with inflation, plus we're showing some solid numbers on the fiscal side. Inflation, you know, is hitting 10, and if we're talking food, it's at 9. So yeah, we're clearly on the path to slowing it down. At the same time, the strength we're showing with our fiscal numbers. Back in January, to lock in that positive financial result, we actually cut spending by 30%. And just so you know, in February, it dropped another 36%. Meaning, our fiscal belt tightening isn't letting up. It's like we got a chainsaw and a blender. But let me tell you, if you keep that blender going long enough, it turns into a chainsaw too. So what's the deal in this context? Well, the thing is, after a good while, the country's risk took a dive down to 1,500. The gap's totally gone, poof. So if y'all grab the importer exchange rate and smack on the country tax, you're looking at a rate close to 10.50. But peep the numbers from yesterday, everything was at 9.95 and 1,000 and 10.15. So yeah. The gap's gone, vanished. And when you folks, y'all remember, right? There was a time folks started questioning, saying we got to switch up the monetary policy, that we had to change headling. But now, check it out, you got the whole futures curve in line with the monetary policy set by the central bank. So it has, the stabilization process is kicking in real strong. And one thing that's happening is that, this is key, guys, inflation is always and everywhere a money thing. It happens because there's too much cash floating around. So this happens because either supply goes up or demand drops, or both at the same time, right? And that makes all the prices, when you talk cash, go up. Like the dollar's just another price in the economy, but it's also a financial asset. It hikes first. No, there's no such thing as patru, that ain't the thing, man. That's just twisting math around. What's really going on is money's buying power is tanking. And if those economists spent less time with their noses in books and more time looking into how oil lamps work, they'd know prices rise in different stages. So basically, what you guys got is this effect, since it's a financial asset and it bites first. And this is super key because it means at some point down the line, hey, we're going to see inflation rates just plummet. Like if inflation's going to tank at some point, where's the logic in that? All right, check this out if you're looking. The monetary base throughout the 21st century. That gives us an average of 9% of the GDP. Today, the monetary base is like super stressed. In a scenario, if you took the broad view, it's 9. Yeah, but to take that broader approach, you'd need a run where everyone's trying to bail. And the reality is the financial system's pretty tiny. I mean, we're talking loans to the non-financial private sector at 4% of GDP. So what happens when you guys handle deposits? Most of the accounts tied to these deposits are all about salaries or the working capital of businesses. So there's not much room for runs and stuff, you know? So here's what I was getting at. Like how the financial variables were hitting us in a good way. We've seen a nosedive in the country risk dropping into the 1,500 basis point zone. We hit levels like the ones the Macri administration saw back in the day. Bonds were hovering around $50. The futures curve for the buck is all lined up with the central bank's monetary policy moves. And all that stuff, let's just say. Plus, it showed up big time with the buck's price taking a huge dive, which is why all this is kind of showing us that there's light at the end of the tunnel and that at some point, inflation rates are going to start plummeting. Sort of like the market's guess is that. So February closed around 15%, which means another drop of 5 points from the month before. But what about when you strip away the rate hikes and prepaid stuff and all those price corrections that were way overdue during Kirchner's time? You see, like the inflation rate is around 10% by different measures. And check this out. When you look at food, it's around 9%. So yeah, the downward trend in inflation is still going strong. At the same time, even though we're going through a pretty massive belt tightening, it's also true that we're not neglecting social spending, you know? Like we've doubled up on the food card and the universal child allowance. We've doubled the support mechanism for moms, but especially we've quadrupled the assistance funds for the kids. So they're going to school, right? We've got this program reaching out to like 7.3 million kids so they can have their school supplies. And that's not all. We're also setting up ways to help families who can't afford school fees get some funding. Why, you ask? Because let's be real, it's super traumatic. It ain't just tough on parents having to switch their kids' school, but imagine the kids showing up and not seeing any of their usual buddies. Talk about a rough time. We're on it too, making adjustments and providing some social support. Despite all the imbalances we found, and you guys are seeing corruption popping up like all day, every day. So here's the question. We had all these champions fighting against corruption, right? And they didn't catch any of this stuff, like the deal with trust funds, huh? I hate how things are going down with those food handouts, and what's happening with some folks, like for instance. They're cashing in on welfare and jetting off or sailing abroad. Spouting some really offensive stuff or what's going down with the insurance scene. Basically, a bunch of them are shouting about cutting down corruption, but they ain't done squat. So if we're talking about who's not doing their part, it's us. And maybe that's why that whole elite bunch is so freaking out. Diego's getting all worked up, that elite crowd, from that angle. What now? So we believe that at the core, once we get the economy stable, clear up the central bank's balance sheet, and put a stop to creating money from thin air, we'll be ready to lift the exchange controls. So check this out. Like just yesterday, the central bank snagged a cool $313 million, but we're also cracking open more imports, which means this trend's gonna keep on. We're loosening up more restrictions, you know? Hindo, as going by what the International Monetary Fund's casing, we might just be lifting those currency controls mid-year. If we do lift them, the extra demand that it usually swarm the forex market should vanish. Comprecious, that'd mean not just the surplus demand disappearing, but also the overflow of market supply. This would get bond markets amped up, prices jumping, and our country's risk taking a dive. Oh, and interest rates would drop, giving the economy a much-needed bounce back. All of this would rev up the demand for jobs, so real wages would start climbing up. Punto. And in that sense, let me tell you, there's another thing happening. The number of poor and homeless folks would be dropping. That is, once we open up, except for the economy, it's going to bounce back up. And it's not just that, but there will be some extra stuff going down, like the fact that, like how Argentina's institutions are a total wreck. But also, let's not forget, the capital stock is trash too. Yet the marginal productivity of capital in Argentina is sky high, meaning the returns on projects there are through the roof. So even with our institutions in shambles, it's possible that Argentina could still show some real growth despite the messed up institutions it's got. And that's what would create the bounce back, mixing it with growth and all that jazz. It also means a boost, not just in how things are going and jobs and social indicators, but it would also mean our fiscal numbers would get better. And that's when we pry open the door to start cutting taxes more and more. Here's the deal. As the economy expands, instead of doing what other governments did, taking that extra cash to spend more, we're going to give it back to its rightful owners, the entrepreneurs and all the good folks, not those lousy politicians we have. Entrepreneurs and good folks shouldn't have to deal with the garbage politicians we've got. On the other hand, another thing that's super important from where I stand is what we put forward in terms of structural reforms. I don't really know the basics. We sent over 1,000 structural reforms. That is, it's almost hard to believe. We haven't even hit 3 months in office and we've done all this stuff. And well, you'd expect it to be pretty intense, right? So, it all depends on the source. With that in mind, we sent out an urgent necessity decree. And at the same time, we sent out the law of foundations and starting points for the freedom of Argentinians, where basically the logic of the Argentine regulatory framework. It's all about always hitting the symptoms, not the root causes. Let me lay it out with a real solid example. Argentina's got a budget deficit when it runs out of cash. So what they move? They turn to printing money. When they turn to printing money, like for instance, it starts messing up the foreign sector because of fixing the exchange rate, and you see it in the reserve losses. They don't know squat about penal law, exchange capital controls, but with the prices going up, they slap on some controls. Basically, they put price controls, right? And these price controls, they cause shortages. So what do? They put in a supply law. I mean, if you guys look closely, there are tons of controls that stem from the same origin. It's always the same issue, the fiscal deficit. Okay? Can you believe we can tackle it in 3 different ways? We can either go into debt and then Argentina ends up as the world champion of serial defaulting, or we finance it by printing more money and end up knocking off 3 zeros from our currency. Should we just yell, let's slash 3 more while destroying 5 monetary symbols? Yeah, or by hiking up taxes and ending up with the highest formal tax pressure in the world, making the country unviable. So, when the unwanted consequences pop up, I mean, the politicians, instead of fixing the root of the issue, which is the fiscal deficit, what they do is go after the symptoms instead. And that's when all these bizarre regulatory offspring crop up, right? They aim to tackle not the causes, but the effects. Yeah, not about the causes, but the effects. That's why Argentina's got this regulatory mess That's just unlivable. What we did with the executive order and the basic law comes down to three things. First off, giving freedom back. To the people. Take Argentina. I don't know, for instance, the ultimate example, head over to autonomous Buenos Aires. So our idea is that everything's allowed except what's banned. Right? When you hit up autonomous Buenos Aires, basically everything was off limits unless some bureaucrat said, okay. And all that is just a ton of little shops. So I'm telling you, politicians dig regulation too, because these are just a whole bunch of kiosks, and each kiosk slaps on a toll. What's up with these guys getting insanely rich off the hard work of good Argentine folks? So, what we've suggested is moving towards more competitive markets. That is to say, we're talking about making market structures more business friendly, because look, even fascists back businesses, right? So when a crony businessman buddies up with a corrupt politician, they team up to screw over the citizens with their privileges. Nope, that's not a fix we're looking at. We want markets that really push competition. Pro-competition, so we've been totally working on that. Moving to more competitive markets, that's the goal. And that's not all. We've also decided to take on the hotbeds of corruption. And that's a hassle because it means stepping on the toes of politicians and their cronies. I call them the elite, because it's not just the thieving politicians, it's crony businessmen, the union leaders betraying their workers, media on the take, and the professionals who just toe the government line. It's like the state religions workshop just churns out idiots who roam TV channels defending politicians' deals. Man, sometimes I can't tell if they're just playing the fool, are incompetent, uneducated, or if they're actually, part of the very system they're protecting. In that regard, most of the executive order is working just fine. Only two parts are sheltered: labor reform, and on another note, the freeze on sports associations. Which is nuts because it's optional. I'm not saying it's mandatory for them to be private or corporately run. But folks are so steeped in socialism up to their eyeballs that they can't even grasp the concept of having a choice. Like they just don't get what it means to live free. So in that context, look, we're actually planning to have Manchester City buy one of the big clubs in Argentina right now, like making some huge investments. But still, God, everything's at a standstill because we've also got these clubs that are pretty much companies, but let's say they're undercover, everyone's scared, because otherwise the ref might hit them with a massive corruption charge or something. And on the other hand, what happened with the law is super interesting. We experienced a few stages there, both the executive order and the law. They don't rock the boat right now, but what they do hit is the long-term growth rate, meaning instead of taking like 35 years to double the per capita GDP, we can do it in 7. 35 years to double the GDP per head, we can nail it in 7. So what I'm saying is it's less significant in terms of well-being for Argentinians, regardless of any transition that might be going on. Big jump in GDP because it combines the bounce back with growth due to low capital levels that mean high productivity. Just a bit though. So with that in mind, it's these two tools that boost the long-term growth rate. And what happened was being aware of the fiscal problem the provinces were facing, we, as a goodwill gesture, slipped in a temporary measure into the baseline law, which was Chapter 4. That was the chapter where we offered the province a fix for their problem. The provinces didn't quite get that act of goodwill. They took it as a sign of talking about political weakness here. And what does that lead to? Not only that, they were grabbing a slice of the GDP that fixed their budget issues, but they didn't stop there. They went and grabbed another chunk of the GDP for themselves, ripping it right from the nation, obviously. So there they were shouting, yeah, zero deficit, while spending even more. Seriously, the audacity of that move is just obscene. Plus, they started messing with public spending that wasn't even supposed to be on the nation's tap, blowing up our public finances. I mean, if we stuck with Chapter 4, we'd have crashed and burned in 6 months. And that's the consequence of it. Let's just call it the abuses they pulled off and their total miscalculation. Our answer, we ditched Chapter 4. And naturally, when we brought out Chapter 4, Caputo wasn't handing out treats. He said, all right, now it's time for you guys to make the adjustments on your own. So that first dumb take by the Red Circle, thinking we had lost. Look at how now all the provinces are, let's just say, eager to fix up Chapter 4. Because they gotta tighten their belts, but don't wanna, and we've seen quite a few times, it shows they gotta come together, but don't wanna tighten up. So now you can see who really took the loss on that one. But it's not just that. When we dived into the core law, the foundational law, where are we at? Out of roughly 700 articles. Ended up with like 550 for those who say we're totally inflexible. You know what? It's true that we're pretty darn stubborn. We just can't stand any kind of ripoff. We got zero tolerance for thieves. And okay, here's something I got to spill. Back when I was a congressman, I got a lot of flack from the media. And of course, obviously, I mean, I'd always vote on the general stuff, but when it came to the specifics, I would stand up and bail. Because I wasn't about to play along with the political thievery of wheeling and dealing on the specifics, which is where the real swindling happens. And in that regard, the best thing that happened with the base law is that at one point they started hashing out the fiduciary funds, which everyone now realizes were just slush funds for blatant stealing. Right? But this had to go down during a liberal government amidst all the so-called progressives we've had, like nothing ever happened. And that's despite our serial complainers, you know, about those flag bearers of the Republic, or should I say, the very same flag bearers of the Republic who stay silent when the former governor locks up 2 tweeters just for calling out his cheating. Yet they're still quiet, we haven't heard a peep, and that's the issue. It's not just like the hyperinflation they left us with, or that they practically bankrupted countries. They teamed up with Kirchnerism and him, but on top of all that, they've got the nerve to come and lecture us on how to do things. I mean, there's a pretty weird sense of republicanism in Argentina. And in that regard, when the debate over fiduciary funds came up, all the scum surfaced. And again, let's say, since a big part of the so-called elite can't or won't see it, whether it's because they've got entangled interests with the government or they just don't like the liberals or whatever. They sold that it was a defeat. On their return, they didn't understand anything. When I decide to lift the base law from Israel, then the central point is the following. I made them manifest. That is to say, all the thieves were visible, because I'm not going to worry about the orcs, because the orcs are orcs. And they are incorrigible, but at least they are not criminals. According to the fine, they do not intend to be treated like gentlemen because they know that they are criminals and they do not mind showing themselves as criminals. The problem is the white-collar criminal who pretend to be treated like gentlemen and are not, and who show themselves as the standard bearers of change. But when the issue of money comes up, they stop being the gentlemen they are. That really blew up. And the truth is, to get a law that's got a fancy title, but they gutted it because they started to keep their perks, they went on to defend their swindles. Did I prefer to drop it? And what's the best part of all this? They got exposed. Gotta say I love it, because God knows the media's been plastering me all over, accusing me of voting on something, which I didn't. Now it turns out that when we show how all these criminals, traitors, and liars voted, that was called fascism. Because if the votes are public, right?
If you'll allow me, Mr. President, to add to what you're saying. From the most negatively voted items in that session, the two most downvoted were the trust funds and the chance for the national government to privatize public companies. That's crystal clear, and they watered it down. Won't say why, because public companies are just political hangouts.
They treat politics like it's their own piggy bank. Like if they pack it with employees, or right now look at them crying over some fabric, there's this crook yelling, "Woe is me," over fabric like it's a big deal in public spending. I'd say if it's not a biggie, because it doesn't affect his pocket. He's not that same crooks. Yeah, he says that actually it should be made efficient. Every big government guy wanting to swipe our cash speaks about the efficiency state enterprises are supposed to have. Look, there's this, there's that. There's a book by Milton Friedman with Rose, director meaning his later wife. It's called Free to Choose. So it's got this chapter on public spending. He says, the 4 ways to spend: you can spend your money on yourself or on someone else if you can spend. Spending someone else's money on tea or other stuff, that's one thing. But when you're spending your own dough on yourself, you know what you're splurging on, you get what it costs you. You're all about maxing out the benefits, sticking to the budget like a pro. Now, when you spend your own cash on us, especially with gifts, you try to impress while keeping it cheap, minimizing the expense. Another way is to blow someone else's money on yourself. So there you go. Splurging at the priciest restaurant, sipping whatever, like blowing through a green stack a month, just helicoptering everywhere, which I don't even use. Like one of the many savings, You can bet on that. Talking about food quality here. Now, because in the prior administration where I'm living now, that guy used to lunch and dine with crystal champagne every single day. Like, no way I'm giving up. If you guys are heading to AS 5th session, just know. And then, so what's the worst way to waste money, or what other dumb stuff does the government do? So yeah, nothing the government does is done right, except for me. So like, nope. Anything the government does won't be done well, but let's say, hypothetically, if by some miracle somewhere in the world it worked efficiently, that's what these state lovers argue. Well, at least that's not the case in Argentina, not once. Well, at least that's not the case in Argentina. I mean, that never happened in Argentina, not in a single case. And then this same crook was complaining about the way things were wrapped up. So can you picture that suggestion to leave the Telam building's door wide open for folks to just waltz in and take over? It's not just trespassing, but imagine they would have been holed up inside and it would have been a huge mess. So let's put it this way, along with the security minister Sunday at 10 a.m. if you like, at the Olivos residence. One of the calls we made was, yeah, and if not, we'd ring of fences for dinner, and we were going to bring in the cops so no one could get in. And I'm telling you, there was a real chance of a physical showdown. Physical. So that plan, the idea was, let's move forward with this, and those stirring trouble, we'll lock them up. Because the real troublemakers weren't the journalists. Just so you know, within the staff, there are 100 hooligans. Imagine how great it would be to show off the rap sheets of those 100 thugs, to have them come and stand up for me, to defend what we stand for and all that jazz. You see, Kumora, in Domo, it's like when there's a script or state-run media, it all ends up as propaganda tools. In other words, they're using taxpayer money to spin their yarns, which is just twisted too. So with that in mind, they're also chasing down anyone who dares to think differently. Here's another example, or let's say the INAD as a sort of thought police. Right, another thing we did, kicked off with 18 ministries, slashed them down to 8, cut the number of directorates in half, meaning fewer secretariats. Basically, we've taken a chainsaw to it big time. Us. Now, about that speech, from the 1st of March, we pretty much challenged the so-called elite, told them to come clean if they're elite or not. Like, if they want a fight, we're up for it. But hey, if they're aiming to move towards a better Argentina, we'll go back to the fundamental law, restore Chapter 4. And if things progress, we're on to the May Agreement. In that May Pact, there are 10 economic measures lined up. Economic factors are going to decide the foundation for an economy that can boom big time. Part of this plan, obviously, involves getting public spending down to 25% of the economy, which really means the nation's got to tighten its belt, but the state's got to do some trimming too. The days when politicians ruled the roost are over. We're all enslaved, man. There's this killer quote the expert teacher dropped. Like, if someone shows up in life, let's say, to have a good time, not to cough up taxes. But yeah, an outsider's got to take care of this, because for these crooks, paying taxes is all good. To me, the state's a violent criminal org that's living off our backs with this thing called taxes. So yeah, taxes are straight up theft. So basically, what I'm saying is, the best way to make folks happy is to trim down the government, you know? When you don't have enough cash because there's too much government, that's the cold hard truth.
So let's lay it out, Mr. President. Moving to 25% of GDP in public spending means we gotta cut back public spending by 15 points. Why is it at 40 anyway? Plus, let's add that with 25% of GDP, we gotta be on top of our game to do well. Because with 25%, back between the 60s and 2003, Argentina went through some epic crises when it shot up to 40. That's 25 points we're talking about. Getting to that 25% is something we've got to hit for sure to get by all right, and pray we don't get slammed with another Rodrigazo or hyperinflation. We've got neither Martin or God. How did the product score 25 points?
Totally nope. And to show off and kind of wrap things up is super important. What did that basic law plus the executive order mean? If you put all those reforms together, it meant shooting up 90 spots in the Economic Freedom Index. I've been involved in trying to be on par with, say, France, Germany, and Italy. Meaning this was a big deal for our well-being. But since the crooked politicians wouldn't give up their perks, they just keep on, let's say, sentencing us to this misery we're living in now, which we're ready to fight to break free from. But beyond all that, why are we actually making headway despite the dirty politics? Because I know what needs to be done, and I know how to do it, plus I've got the conviction to pull it off. It's no coincidence I chose myself. Put someone like Professor Espert in charge of the Budget and Finance Commission, a born tax expert, let's say. But that's not all. What I'm saying is people have woken up. Look, when I started campaigning for Congress, in Holland Square, I finished by saying that I wasn't here to hurt sheep, but to awaken lions. And you know what the most beautiful thing is? The lions have started to awaken. You know what's the biggest slap in the face the political elite got? The other day we hit a 51 rating and 2.5 million folks watched on YouTube. You know it's over, it's done, the age of freedom has begun. So stay confident because we're gonna make it. Because the ideas of freedom are the ones that matter, the ones that will push us forward. Thank you so much and long live freedom, damn it.
Hello everyone, I'm Daniel, I'm from Argentina and I'm running this channel. The idea of it is to have all Milei videos that are available on the internet so you get to know his ideas and what he has to say. Obviously, I'm very excited about he winning the election on Argentina and becoming president, but I know he has too much more than that to offer to the world and to the ideas of freedom and about being free, and all regarding that. Let me know if you have any questions. I will reply all the questions that are being asked on the comment section, whatever they are. If you want to get to know more context or about one particular meaning of one particular thing, let me know if you have any questions. Just type them down there, and I hope you subscribe and put the bell so you get a notification when a new video is uploaded. My commitment is to, or my intention more than a commitment, is to upload one video every day. So subscribe because more content is coming, and also occasionally I'll be uploading videos explaining things or adding more context, and also here and there maybe a live session, so that's coming. Hit subscribe and let me know again if you got any questions. See you soon, bye.